In the winter of 1694, England found itself trapped in a crisis that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the nation. War with France had drained the royal treasury to its depths, and King William III faced a predicament that no amount of charm or decree could solve. The government needed money, vast sums of it, and the traditional methods of raising funds had failed spectacularly. The crown had already squeezed its subjects through taxation until the well ran dry. Borrowing from wealthy merchants had become nearly impossible. Trust in the government's ability to repay had evaporated like morning mist. Its previous loans had gone unpaid. Bonds had been dishonored, and the reputation of the English state as a borrower had sunk to levels that would embarrass a common debtor. Into this desperate situation stepped a Scottish merchant named William Paterson, a man whose vision would reshape not only England, but the entire world of finance. Paterson had spent years wandering through the financial centers of Europe, absorbing ideas and watching how money moved through the great trading cities. He had seen the power that banks wielded in Amsterdam and Venice, and he understood something that most of his contemporaries did not. What Paterson proposed seemed almost magical in its simplicity, though its implications would echo through centuries. He suggested creating a bank, but not just any bank. This institution would lend the government the colossal sum of £1,200,000, an amount so large it seemed almost fictional to the people of that era. In exchange, the subscribers who pooled their money to create this loan would receive something unprecedented. The government would grant these subscribers the right to operate as a corporate bank, to accept deposits, to make loans, and most crucially, to issue paper notes that would circulate as money. The crown would pay interest on its debt at 8% per year, a rate that seemed generous to desperate borrowers and profitable to cautious lenders. This annual payment of £96,000 would flow from the public treasury into private hands, a river of gold that would never cease as long as the arrangement stood. But the true genius of the scheme lay deeper than these surface terms. The bank would not actually need to have all the money it appeared to possess. By issuing paper notes against the gold and silver in its vaults, the bank could create what seemed like money out of promises and confidence. Depositors would leave their coins with the bank and receive paper receipts. These receipts would circulate as payment, while the original coins remained locked away, allowing the bank to lend those same coins to others. The proposal sparked fierce debate in Parliament and the coffee houses of London. Many saw it as nothing more than an elaborate swindle, a way for wealthy merchants to enrich themselves at public expense. Others recognized it as a dangerous foreign idea that would give too much power to a private corporation. The notion of a company creating money simply by writing notes seemed like alchemy, or worse, like counterfeiting dressed in legal robes. Yet desperation proved stronger than principle, and the political will to fund the war overcame philosophical objections. The Act of Parliament that created the bank received royal assent, and the subscription books opened to the public. Within just 12 days, the entire sum had been pledged, testament to how many wealthy individuals saw opportunity in this novel arrangement. The subscribers came from the merchant class and the aristocracy, from those who had prospered in trade and those who had inherited ancient fortunes. They saw in this bank not just a patriotic loan to fund the war effort, but an engine for multiplying their wealth. By pooling their resources, they would create an institution that could do what no individual could accomplish alone. The Bank of England opened for business in the Mercer's Hall, a modest building compared to the grand structures it would later occupy. The first governor, Sir John Houblon, presided over operations that must have seemed both thrilling and terrifying. The bank held the government's debt, accepted deposits from the public, made loans to merchants, and issued its first banknotes. These early notes carried elaborate engravings meant to thwart counterfeiters, though the technology of the age made replication far easier than anyone wished. Each note bore a promise to pay the bearer in gold or silver on demand, a guarantee that rested entirely on trust. The paper itself had no intrinsic value, but if people believed the bank would honor its promise, then the paper would circulate as readily as coin. What few understood at the time was that this arrangement contained a fundamental transformation of the nature of money itself. Previously, money had been things of substance, coins made of precious metal that carried value in their very composition. Now, money was becoming a promise, a claim on value rather than value embodied. The bank could issue more notes than it held coin, as long as not everyone demanded redemption at once. This practice, which would later be called fractional reserve banking, allowed the bank to expand the money supply beyond the physical limits of gold and silver. When the bank made a loan, it did not hand over bags of coins, but rather its own promissory notes. These notes entered circulation, increasing the amount of currency flowing through the economy. In effect, the bank was creating money, though this power remained shrouded in the technical language of banking and the secrecy of the counting house. The relationship between the bank and the government formed a complex web of mutual dependence. The crown needed the bank's money to wage war and administer the realm. The bank needed the government's legal protection and the prestige of its association with royal power. Neither could easily exist without the other, yet their interests did not always align. Shareholders in the bank expected profits and security for their investment. The government wanted access to funds on favorable terms and the flexibility to borrow more when circumstances demanded. These competing desires created tensions that would resurface repeatedly across the coming decades. The bank operated as a private corporation pursuing profit, yet it served functions that resembled those of a state institution. The charter granted by Parliament gave the bank a monopoly on certain banking activities, but stopped short of making it the sole source of currency. Other banks could still operate, and other merchants could still issue their own notes and bills of exchange. Yet the Bank of England possessed advantages that no competitor could match. Its connection to the government gave its notes a credibility that private merchants could not replicate. The early years tested the bank's resilience and revealed vulnerabilities in its structure. When demands for gold increased, the bank sometimes struggled to meet all requests for redemption. Rumors of instability could trigger runs, as depositors rushed to convert their paper into metal before the supply vanished. The bank learned to maintain reserves, to manage its lending carefully, and to cultivate an image of impregnability, even when its faults grew light. War continued to drain resources, and the government returned to the bank repeatedly for additional loans. Each new advance bound the two institutions more tightly together. The bank extended credit, the government granted new privileges in return, and the cycle perpetuated itself. This pattern would define their relationship for generations, a dance of mutual need and mutual benefit. The original subscribers to the bank became wealthier as the institution prospered. Dividends flowed from the bank to shareholders, representing their share of the interest payments from the government and the profits from ordinary banking operations. These individuals formed a new aristocracy of finance, their fortunes built not on land or military conquest, but on the manipulation of credit and currency. Critics observed this accumulation of private wealth through public debt with growing alarm. They saw a system where common taxpayers funded interest payments that enriched a small class of financiers. The bank appeared to profit from the nation's difficulties, growing stronger as the government grew more indebted. These observations would fuel opposition to the bank for centuries to come. Yet, defenders argued that the bank provided essential services that benefited the entire economy, creating a stable currency and facilitating commerce. The bank enabled trade to flourish. Merchants could conduct business with greater confidence, knowing that payments could be made reliably. The economy grew more sophisticated, moving beyond simple barter and coin toward complex financial instruments. The bank also brought a new level of organization to government finance, instead of scrambling for loans from various sources on unpredictable terms. The Crown could now rely on a steady partner. The bank's expertise in financial matters helped stabilize public credit and made England a more attractive destination for investment. Stability had tangible benefits, even if the costs remained hidden in the fine print of agreements. As the 17th century drew to a close, the Bank of England had established itself as a permanent fixture in British life. What had begun as an emergency measure to fund a war had become an institution that no one could imagine dismantling. The experiment in private money creation had succeeded beyond even Patterson's ambitious dreams. The system contained contradictions that would take centuries to fully reveal themselves. A private corporation controlled much of the nation's money supply, yet claimed to serve the public interest. Shareholders pursued profit, yet the bank's actions affected everyone. The promise of redemption in gold backed the paper currency, yet the bank issued far more paper than it held metal. These tensions remained dormant in times of prosperity, but would erupt with devastating force when confidence wavered. Looking back from the vantage point of later centuries, historians would debate whether the creation of the Bank of England represented financial innovation or the beginning of a system that concentrated power in dangerous ways. The truth, as so often happens, contained elements of both perspectives. The bank solved immediate problems while creating new complications that would unfold gradually across generations. What remained undeniable was that the nature of money had changed forever. No longer would currency be limited to physical objects of intrinsic worth. Instead, money would increasingly become an abstraction, a social agreement, a collective faith in institutions and their promises. The Bank of England stood at the threshold of this transformation, guarding the door between the old world of coin and the new world of credit that was only beginning to take shape in the shadows of London's financial district. The Bank of England had barely settled into its role when a rival emerged that would threaten its very existence. In 1711, the South Sea Company received its charter from Parliament, ostensibly to trade with South America, but actually to assume a portion of the national debt. The company's true purpose mirrored that of the bank itself, converting government obligations into corporate profit through financial engineering rather than genuine commerce. The South Sea Company promised investors vast riches from trade monopolies in distant lands. Territories where Spanish galleons carried silver and exotic goods flowed through colonial ports. Yet, the reality behind these promises remained far more mundane and far more sinister. The company's directors cared less about shipping and trade than about manipulating stock prices and political connections. They understood that fortunes could be made not from actual business, but from the perception of future profits. Competition between the bank and the South Sea Company grew fierce as both institutions vied for control over government debt and the privileges that came with it. The directors of each company maneuvered in Parliament, offering loans on favorable terms, bribing officials with stock, and spreading rumors about their competitors. This rivalry represented more than simple business competition. It reflected a struggle over which group of financiers would dominate England's emerging financial system. The bank's directors watched with growing alarm as the South Sea Company expanded its operations and its ambitions. In 1719, the company proposed a scheme so audacious that it shocked even the jaded observers of London finance. The directors offered to assume nearly the entire national debt, converting government bonds into company stock. In exchange, they demanded exclusive privileges and annual payments from the Treasury that would make the arrangement extraordinarily profitable. Parliament debated this proposal with an intensity that revealed how much was at stake. The Bank of England countered with its own offer to take on the debt, triggering a bidding war where both institutions competed to lend the government money on increasingly generous terms. The spectacle revealed the strange logic of the financial world, where powerful corporations fought for the privilege of holding government obligations that in earlier eras would have been considered burdens. The South Sea Company won this contest through a combination of better terms and more effective bribery. Company stock was distributed freely to ministers, members of parliament, and even the royal mistresses. Those who held power found their interests aligned with the company's success, creating a web of corruption that extended to the highest levels of government. The bank had been outmaneuvered, and its position as the primary financier of the state suddenly appeared vulnerable. What followed became one of history's most infamous episodes of financial madness, as the South Sea Company prepared to execute its debt conversion scheme. Its directors began manipulating the stock price upward through carefully orchestrated purchases and wildly optimistic announcements. They spoke of fleets sailing to gather untold wealth, of trade agreements that would enrich every shareholder, of dividends that would flow like rivers of gold. The public, watching the stock price climb day after day, succumbed to a fever that overcame rational judgment. Investors mortgaged their homes to buy shares. Aristocrats liquidated estates. Servants invested their life savings. The price of South Sea stock soared from £100 per share to over £1,000 in a matter of months, driven not by any underlying value, but by pure speculation and the fear of missing extraordinary gains. Dozens of other companies sprang up to capitalize on this mania, offering shares in ventures that ranged from the implausible to the completely imaginary. Promoters sold stock in companies to drain marshes, to extract silver from lead, to build perpetual motion machines. And in one famous case, for a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Investors eagerly purchased shares in all of them, each convinced they had discovered the path to instant wealth. The Bank of England stood apart from this frenzy, its directors observing the spectacle with a mixture of envy and dread. Kay recognized the South Sea bubble for what it was, an illusion built on manipulation and greed that would inevitably collapse. Yet, they also saw their own institution losing ground as capital flowed away from safe bank stock toward the glittering promises of the South Sea Company and its imitators. In the summer of 1720, reality began to intrude on fantasy. Observant investors noticed that the South Sea Company produced no actual profits to justify its soaring stock price. The promised fleets remained largely imaginary. The trade monopolies proved worthless, as Spain refused to allow significant British commerce in its colonial territories. The entire edifice rested on nothing more substantial than the willingness of new investors to pay higher prices than those who came before. When confidence broke, it shattered completely and instantaneously. The stock price collapsed with a speed that stunned everyone. Shares that had traded at £1,000 became worth 100, then 50, then less. Fortunes accumulated over generations vanished in weeks. Thousands of families faced financial ruin. The suicide rate climbed as desperate investors confronted losses they could never recover. The social and political fallout from the South Sea catastrophe reshaped British society and finance for generations. Angry mobs gathered outside the homes of company directors, demanding justice and restitution. Parliament launched investigations that revealed the extent of the corruption, though the most powerful culprits often escaped serious punishment. The Chancellor of the Exchequer fled to the continent to avoid prosecution. Lesser figures went to prison or faced financial penalties that seemed trivial compared to the destruction they had caused. For the Bank of England, the collapse of the South Sea Company represented both vindication and opportunity. The bank's conservative approach and refusal to engage in wild speculation had protected its depositors and shareholders from catastrophic losses. Its reputation for stability grew stronger, precisely because it had not participated in the mania. People who had lost everything in South Sea stock now saw the bank as an island of safety in a sea of financial chaos. Yet the crisis also revealed deeper truths about the financial system that made even the bank's directors uncomfortable. The collapse demonstrated how fragile confidence could be, how quickly paper wealth could evaporate, how interconnected all financial institutions had become. When the South Sea Company failed, It dragged down other companies and threatened the stability of the entire credit system. Banks called in loans. Merchants could not meet their obligations. Trade contracted as trust disappeared. The bank found itself in an unexpected position as the South Sea crisis unfolded. Other institutions turned to it for support, seeking loans to meet their obligations and survive the panic. The bank's strong reserves and government backing made it the most creditworthy entity in a landscape of failing enterprises. Without any formal mandate or clear precedent, the bank began acting as what would later be called a lender of last resort. This role emerged organically from circumstance rather than deliberate policy. The bank's directors did not set out to rescue the financial system. They simply responded to requests for assistance from institutions whose failure would threaten the bank's own interests. If major merchants went bankrupt, they would default on loans from the bank. If other banks collapsed, panic might spread to the bank itself. Enlightened self-interest drove the bank to provide liquidity to the market. The lessons from the South Sea disaster influenced financial regulation and practice for decades. Parliament passed the Bubble Act, restricting the formation of joint stock companies and requiring royal charters for such ventures. The legislation aimed to prevent future speculative manias by making it harder to create companies whose only purpose was to separate fools from their money. The law would remain in force for over a century, shaping the development of British commerce. More subtly, the crisis changed how people thought about financial institutions and their proper role. The idea emerged that certain institutions bore responsibilities beyond simple profit-seeking. The Bank of England, by virtue of its size, its government connections, and its central position in the credit system, could not act as just another private company. Its decisions affected the entire economy, and with that influence came obligations. This realization developed slowly and incompletely. The bank remained a private corporation owned by shareholders who expected dividends. Its directors pursued profit and guarded their privileges jealously. Yet, they also began to understand that the bank's stability benefited everyone, and that maintaining confidence in the institution required acting prudently, even when reckless speculation might yield higher short-term returns. The South Sea episode also highlighted the dangers of allowing financial institutions to become too intertwined with government. The corruption that enabled the bubble traced directly to the company's political connections, and its role in managing state debt. When private profit and public policy mixed so thoroughly, the result served neither private enterprise nor public welfare. Instead, it created opportunities for the unscrupulous to exploit both for personal gain. For the Bank of England, navigating this terrain required constant vigilance and political skill. The bank needed government favor to maintain its privileges. It had had to avoid becoming so dependent on political patronage that its judgment became clouded. Its delicate balance would challenge every generation of bank directors with varying degrees of success. The decades following the South Sea collapse saw the bank strengthen its position gradually but steadily, without serious competition from the discredited South Sea Company. The bank could expand its operations and deepen its relationship with the government. The volume of banknotes in circulation increased. The bank's lending operations grew more sophisticated. Its influence over interest rates and credit conditions became more pronounced. Yet, the fundamental contradictions in the bank's position remained unresolved. It was a private company exercising public functions. It created money but answered to shareholders rather than citizens. It possessed enormous power over the economy but operated with minimal oversight or accountability. These tensions would surface repeatedly whenever crisis struck or critics questioned the system. The South Sea disaster taught the financial community that bubbles could form and burst with devastating consequences, yet it did not prevent future manias. Human nature remained unchanged, and the desire for quick riches continued to overcome prudent judgment when circumstances seemed favorable. The bank would witness many more cycles of expansion and collapse, each one teaching similar lessons that were quickly forgotten when optimism returned. What changed after 1720 was the recognition that someone needed to stand ready to provide stability when panic threatened. Markets could not regulate themselves perfectly. Speculation could spiral out of control. Failures could cascade through interconnected institutions. In such moments, an anchor was necessary, an institution strong enough and trusted enough to calm the storm. The Bank of England, almost by accident, had assumed this role. It did not seek the responsibility, and many of its directors resented the burdens that came with it. Yet history and circumstance had thrust the bank into a position where its actions carried weight beyond its private interests. The institution that began as a scheme to fund a war had evolved into something more complex and more essential. This evolution would continue across the coming centuries, driven by crises and adaptations, by political pressures and economic realities. The bank would grow more powerful and more public in character, even as it remained technically private in ownership. The contradictions would sharpen until eventually they could no longer be ignored or papered over with convenient fictions. But in the aftermath of the South Sea catastrophe, these future developments remained hidden in the fog of time. What was clear to observers in the 1720s was that the financial landscape had been permanently altered. The old certainties about money and value had been shaken. New institutions had emerged with frightening power, and the Bank of England stood at the center of this transformed world, its role still evolving, its ultimate destiny unknown even to those who guided its operations. The British Empire did not build itself through courage and gunpowder alone. Behind every colonial conquest, every distant fortress, every regiment sent to subdue foreign lands, stood a complex machinery of finance that transformed blood and territory into profitable enterprises. The Bank of England sat at the heart of this machinery, quietly converting imperial ambition into currency and credit. Throughout the 18th century, Britain engaged in a nearly continuous series of wars that expanded its global reach. Each conflict required enormous sums to maintain armies, equip navies, and supply garrisons scattered across multiple continents. The government turned repeatedly to the bank for loans that grew larger with each new campaign. What began as emergency borrowing became a permanent condition, a state of perpetual debt that paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened the nation. The 7 Years' War, which raged from 1756 to 1763, demonstrated this dynamic with particular clarity. Britain fought France and Spain across Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean simultaneously. The financial demands of such a sprawling conflict exceeded anything the country had previously attempted. Tax revenues, even when squeezed to their limits, covered only a fraction of military expenditures. The bank provided the crucial bridge between immediate needs and future tax collections. It extended credit to the government, creating money through the issuance of notes and the manipulation of accounts. These funds flowed outward to pay soldiers, purchase supplies, and bribe allies. The debt accumulated on the government's books, but the empire expanded. And with that expansion came access to resources and trade routes that generated new revenue streams. Victory in the 7 Years' War brought Canada, vast territories in India, and Caribbean islands under British control. These acquisitions seemed to justify the enormous debts incurred during the fighting. Yet, the accounting remained deliberately murky. The costs of conquering and administering these territories never appeared on balance sheets alongside the profits extracted from them. The bank financed the initial conquests, but the ongoing expenses of maintaining empire drained resources in ways that contemporary observers struggled to measure accurately. The East India Company exemplified the entanglement between finance, commerce, and imperial expansion. This corporation, granted monopoly trading rights in Asia, gradually transformed from a commercial venture into a sovereign power ruling millions of people. The company maintained its own armies, collected taxes, administered justice, and waged wars. It functioned as a private empire within the larger British Empire, and its relationship with the Bank of England grew increasingly intimate. When the East India Company needed capital to expand operations or recover from setbacks, it turned to the bank for loans. When its servants returned from India with fortunes acquired through trade and conquest, they deposited those funds in the bank. The two institutions became intertwined through credit relationships and overlapping directors. Men who served on the bank's court of directors often held positions in the East India Company as well, creating a unity of interest between finance and colonial exploitation. The wealth that flowed back to England from India staggered the imagination. Company servants accumulated personal fortunes that rivaled those of aristocrats. They purchased estates, entered Parliament, and married into noble families. This influx of colonial wealth circulated through the British economy, but much of it passed through the Bank of England, either as deposits, as loan payments, or as investment capital, seeking profitable deployment. The human cost of this wealth remained invisible to those who profited from it. Famines in Bengal killed millions when company policies disrupted traditional agriculture and diverted resources for export. Artisans who had practiced their crafts for generations found themselves impoverished as British manufactured goods flooded local markets. Traditional economies were dismantled and rebuilt to serve the needs of distant traders and investors. None of these costs appeared in the bank's ledgers. The institution measured success in pounds and shillings, in dividends paid and reserves accumulated, the suffering of distant populations, the destruction of ancient societies, the violence required to maintain control over unwilling subjects. All of this remained external to the financial calculations that guided the bank's operations. The American colonies presented a different challenge to the imperial financial system. These territories had developed their own economic structures and chafed under restrictions designed to benefit British merchants and manufacturers. Colonial assemblies resisted taxes imposed to pay for debts incurred defending and administering territories the colonists believed they had settled through their own efforts. The Bank of England held substantial quantities of government debt that had been issued to finance military operations in North America. When colonial resistance turned to rebellion, the bank's interests aligned firmly with suppressing the uprising. The institution extended new loans to fund military expeditions aimed at restoring order. Each shipload of soldiers sent across the Atlantic represented not just a political decision, but a financial calculation about the value of maintaining imperial control. The loss of the American colonies dealt a blow to imperial prestige, but barely dented the financial system that had grown around empire. The bank's loans to the government remained secure, backed by the taxing power of Parliament over the remaining territories. The setback in America redirected imperial energies toward Asia and Africa, where opportunities for exploitation appeared even more promising. The Napoleonic Wars that dominated the period from 1793 to 1815 pushed the relationship between the bank and government to new extremes. The conflict with France consumed resources on a scale that dwarfed all previous wars. Britain funded not only its own military forces, but also subsidized coalition partners across Europe. The financial strain became so severe that in 1797, the bank suspended the convertibility of its notes into gold. This suspension represented a fundamental break with the bank's founding promise. The notes that circulated as money could no longer be redeemed for precious metal on demand. Instead, they became pure fiat currency, backed only by the government's promise to eventually honor them and by legal tender laws that forced people to accept them as payment. The suspension, initially presented as a temporary emergency measure, would last for more than 2 decades. During this period, the bank essentially printed money to fund the war effort. The quantity of notes in circulation expanded dramatically, untethered from the constraint of gold reserves. This monetary expansion had complex effects. It facilitated military spending and allowed the government to prosecute the war more vigorously, but it also caused inflation, reducing the purchasing power of ordinary people's incomes and savings while enriching those who held real assets or who could adjust their prices quickly. The bank's profits soared during the Napoleonic Wars. The institution earned interest on massive government loans while facing few of the risks that normally accompanied such lending. The government could not default without destroying its own credit, and the legal tender status of banknotes meant the bank could always meet its obligations by issuing more paper. It was a remarkable arrangement, one that transferred wealth from the general population to bank shareholders through the hidden mechanism of inflation. Victory over Napoleon in 1815 left Britain as the dominant global power, but it also left the nation staggering under debts that seemed almost impossible to repay. The government owed the bank and other creditors sums that exceeded the total value of annual tax revenues by many times over. Servicing this debt required dedicating a large portion of government income simply to interest payments, money that flowed from taxpayers to bondholders in a continuous stream. This debt burden had profound political consequences. It made the government dependent on maintaining the confidence of creditors and resistant to policies that might threaten financial stability. Social reforms that might benefit the poor but alarm investors became difficult to pursue. The needs of finance increasingly shaped policy decisions, often in ways that remained invisible to those affected. The bank returned to gold convertibility in 1821, a decision that required painful deflation and economic adjustment. The quantity of money in circulation contracted as the bank rebuilt its gold reserves. Prices fell, businesses failed, and unemployment rose. These costs fell heavily on working people, while creditors benefited from receiving repayment in currency that had grown more valuable. The restoration of the gold standard served the interests of finance at the expense of productive enterprise. Throughout this entire period, the bank maintained its formal status as a private corporation. Shareholders received dividends from profits earned through the institution's privileged position. The court of directors made decisions based on what would benefit shareholders rather than what might serve broader public interests. Yet, the bank's actions affected everyone in the country, and indeed, everyone touched by British imperial power across the globe. The contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore. An institution that exercised such enormous influence over the economy and that benefited so greatly from government privileges could not reasonably claim to be simply another private business. Yet efforts to reform the bank, or subject it to greater public control, met fierce resistance from those who profited from existing arrangements. Colonial expansion continued throughout the 19th century, and the bank continued to finance it. Wars in Burma, Afghanistan, China, and Africa all required loans that the bank readily provided. Each new territory brought new opportunities for trade and investment, but also new costs for administration and defense. The empire grew larger even as questions mounted about whether the enterprise produced genuine benefits for anyone beyond a narrow class of financiers, merchants, and colonial administrators. The machinery of imperial finance operated largely in the shadows, its mechanisms understood only by specialists. Ordinary people saw the symbols of empire, the maps colored in British red, the stories of adventure and conquest. They did not see the ledgers that recorded debts and interest payments, the complicated instruments that transferred wealth from colonized populations to distant investors, the ways that their own taxes supported a system that enriched others. The Bank of England occupied a unique position in this system. It was neither purely British nor purely private. Its notes circulated globally, accepted in transactions from Calcutta to Cape Town. Its credit sustained an empire that encompassed a quarter of the world's population. Yet, it answered to shareholders, not to the people whose labor ultimately generated the wealth that flowed through its accounts. This arrangement would persist for generations, adapting to new circumstances, but preserving its essential character. A bank would finance 2 world wars, weather the collapse of empire, and transform itself repeatedly. Yet, the fundamental dynamic established in the 18th century, The use of private financial institutions to pursue imperial ambitions while distributing the costs widely and concentrating the benefits narrowly would prove remarkably durable. The hidden history of how the bank financed empire reveals uncomfortable truths about the foundations of British prosperity. Wealth that appeared to result from industriousness and innovation, often traced back to violence and exploitation administered through financial instruments. The bank did not pull triggers or swing swords, but it provided the means for others to do so, and it profited from the results. These historical patterns cast long shadows into the present. The global financial system that dominates the contemporary world evolved from institutions and practices developed to serve imperial expansion. Understanding this history becomes essential for anyone seeking to comprehend how power and wealth flow through modern economic structures. The Bank of England's role in financing empire offers a case study in how financial institutions can become engines of extraction. Using the abstract language of banking to obscure concrete harms inflicted on real people in distant places. The power to create money represents perhaps the most consequential privilege any institution can possess. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Bank of England fought a prolonged campaign to monopolize this power, eliminating competitors and establishing its notes as the only truly legitimate currency in England. This battle played out through legislation and market forces, but also through hangings and transportation to penal colonies. Before the bank achieved dominance, England possessed a chaotic monetary landscape where dozens of entities issued their own forms of paper currency. Country banks and provincial towns printed notes backed by their own reserves. Goldsmith firms continued the ancient practice of issuing receipts that circulated as money. Even individual merchants of sufficient reputation could create instruments that others accepted as payment. This multiplicity of currencies reflected local trust networks, but created enormous confusion for anyone attempting to conduct business across regions. The bank's notes carried advantages that private issuers could not match. The institution's royal charter and government backing lent credibility that no merchant house could replicate. The bank's substantial reserves and careful management reduced the risk that its notes would become worthless. As the bank's reputation grew, its notes circulated more widely and commanded acceptance, even from those who had never dealt directly with the institution. Yet the bank faced persistent competition from country banks that served local economies the bank's London operations could not reach effectively. These provincial institutions knew their customers intimately and could make lending decisions based on personal knowledge that the bank's distant directors lacked. Country banks issued their own notes, which circulated within their regions and provided the currency that farmers, shopkeepers, and small manufacturers needed to conduct daily business. The bank pursued a strategy of gradually restricting competitors' ability to issue currency while expanding its own note circulation. Legislative changes prohibited new joint stock banks from issuing notes beyond a certain distance from London. Regulations imposed capital requirements and operational restrictions that many smaller banks struggled to meet. Each new law chipped away at the bank's competitors, favoring the established institution over upstart rivals. This campaign faced opposition from those who recognized that concentrating monetary control in a single private corporation posed dangers of its own. Critics argued that regional banks better understood local needs and that diversity in note issuance provided safeguards against the failure of any single institution. Monopoly, they warned, would give the bank power to manipulate the currency supply for private benefit, regardless of broader economic consequences. These objections could not overcome the political influence the bank had accumulated. Through decades of financing, government operations, Parliament passed legislation that progressively narrowed the field of legitimate currency issuers. By the middle of the 19th century, the bank had achieved effective monopoly over large denomination notes throughout England. Those small notes and regional bank currencies persisted in limited forms. Securing legal monopoly represented only part of the challenge. The bank also had to defend its currency against counterfeiters who who recognized that reproducing banknotes offered a path to wealth that required only skill with engraving tools and access to paper and ink. Counterfeiting had plagued currency systems since ancient times, but the introduction of paper money made the crime both easier and more profitable. The bank's early notes incorporated elaborate designs meant to thwart copiers, with intricate patterns, watermarks, and fine script that demanded considerable artistic ability to reproduce. Yet, determined counterfeiters studied these security features and learned to create forgeries convincing enough to fool casual inspection. Some fake notes passed through dozens of transactions before anyone detected their fraudulent nature. The bank and the government responded to counterfeiting with draconian severity. Parliament made the crime a capital offense, punishable by death. The logic behind this extreme penalty reflected not just concern about financial losses, but recognition that counterfeiting threatened the foundation of the entire monetary system. People lost confidence in their ability to distinguish genuine notes from forgeries. Paper currency would collapse back into worthless paper. Executions for counterfeiting became public spectacles meant to terrorize potential criminals and restore confidence in the currency. Men and women convicted of making or passing false notes were hanged at Tyburn and later at Newgate Prison before crowds that sometimes numbered in the thousands. The condemned often came from desperate poverty, having turned to counterfeiting as a means of survival rather than enrichment. But the law made no distinction between necessity and greed. The cases that made their way to trial revealed the human dimensions of currency crime. Some mother of young children might be convicted for passing a single counterfeit £5 note she had received unknowingly in trade. A struggling craftsman might face the gallows for using his engraving skills to produce notes that kept his family fed. The wealthy bank directors who set policy rarely witnessed the executions their institution demanded, but the condemned faced their debts, knowing their crime was harming an institution that controlled more wealth than they could imagine. Some counterfeiting operations achieved remarkable sophistication. Criminal networks established workshops with skilled engravers, quality paper supplies, and distribution channels that moved fake notes throughout the country. These organizations operated almost as shadow banks, creating currency that circulated alongside genuine notes and extracting real value from pieces of printed paper. The most famous counterfeiters became folk heroes to some segments of the population that resented the bank's power. Stories circulated of clever forgers who outwitted the authorities for years, of ordinary people who struck back against an unjust financial system by creating money for themselves. These narratives romanticized activities that destroyed lives and undermined economic stability. Yet, they reflected genuine anger about wealth, concentration, and the perception that the bank itself engaged in a form of legalized counterfeiting. The bank invested heavily in improving security features to stay ahead of counterfeiters. New printing techniques incorporated multiple colors, raised textures, and complex patterns that defied replication with available technology. The institution hired the finest engravers and artists to design notes that functioned as miniature works of art, while incorporating features that even skilled copiers struggled to match. Despite these efforts, counterfeiting persisted throughout the 19th century. The death penalty failed to eliminate the crime, so it certainly discouraged some potential offenders and satisfied the bank's desire for harsh punishment. Eventually, reformers succeeded in reducing the penalty to transportation or imprisonment, recognizing that execution had proven both cruel and ineffective as deterrents. The battle against counterfeiting raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of money itself. What fundamental difference existed between the bank creating notes through bookkeeping entries and a criminal printing similar notes with stolen plates? Both produced paper that had no intrinsic value. Both relied on others accepting the paper as genuine. The key distinction lay entirely in legal authorization and social acceptance, not in any material difference between the pieces of paper. This realization troubled philosophers and economists who pondered the foundations of the monetary system. Money had become a social convention, collective agreement to treat certain objects as valuable regardless of their physical properties. The bank's monopoly rested on law and custom rather than anything essential in the notes themselves. A perfect counterfeit, if never detected, functioned identically to a genuine note. The bank's directors understood these subtleties and recognized that maintaining confidence required constant vigilance and visible punishment of those who challenged the currency monopoly. They could not allow counterfeiting to appear easy or profitable, lest others attempt it and undermine the system. The harsh penalties served not just to punish individual criminals, but to protect the broader fiction that banknotes represented stable value. As the 19th century progressed, the bank achieved nearly complete dominance over English currency. Its notes circulated throughout the country and were accepted without question in nearly all transactions above a trivial size. Alternative currencies declined to insignificance as country banks either failed or voluntarily gave up note issuance in favor of simply holding accounts with the Bank of England. This consolidation concentrated enormous power in a single institution. The bank could expand or contract the money supply through decisions made in private by its court of directors. These decisions affected prices, employment, and economic activity throughout the nation, yet they occurred without democratic input or meaningful oversight. The bank remained a private corporation, pursuing its own interests, even as it exercised functions that resembled those of a central state institution. The transition from commodity money to fiat currency accelerated during this period. Gold and silver coins continued to circulate. But for large transactions and for the settlement of accounts between banks, paper notes dominated. The economy increasingly ran on pieces of paper whose value derived not from the metal content, but from confidence in the issuing institution. This transformation had profound implications that few contemporaries fully grasped. Money was becoming information, a system of credits and debits recorded in ledgers rather than physical objects with intrinsic worth. The Bank of England stood at the center of this information system, functioning as the ultimate ledger keeper whose records determined who possessed claims on real resources. The legal monopoly on currency issuance, won through decades of political maneuvering and enforced through brutal criminal penalties, represented the culmination of the bank's evolution from a private lending institution into something resembling a true central bank. Yet the institution retains its private character, creating a hybrid entity that served both public functions and private interests. Critics continue to object that this arrangement gave too much power to unelected directors who answered only to shareholders. They pointed out that the bank's monopoly allowed it to earn profits from the currency itself, charging interest on loans that created money from nothing. The institution extracted value from the entire economy simply by controlling the medium of exchange. These criticisms gained little traction against the entrenched power of an institution that had made itself indispensable. The government depended on the bank for credit and monetary management. Merchants relied on banknotes for commerce. The wealthy held bank stock as a secure investment. The system had become too embedded in the fabric of economic life to dismantle without causing disruption that seemed worse than the problems it would solve. The bank's victory in establishing a note monopoly represented a turning point in financial history. It demonstrated that control over currency could be concentrated in a single institution through a combination of legal privilege, superior resources, and ruthless enforcement. This model would be replicated in other countries as central banks emerged worldwide, each claiming monopoly rights over currency issuance within their territories. Yet, the human cost of establishing this monopoly often went unacknowledged. The executed counterfeiters, the families destroyed by the loss of breadwinners to the gallows or penal colonies. The small banks driven into failure by regulations designed to protect a bank's privileged position. All of these represented casualties in a campaign to consolidate financial power. The notes that circulated through the British economy, accepted as easily as gold had once been, carried invisible stains from this history. Each bill represented not just a claim on resources, but a victory in a struggle to control the very definition and creation of money. The Bank of England had won the struggle, establishing itself as the gatekeeper of currency and the arbiter of what counted as legitimate exchange within the realm. This power would only grow in the coming decades as the bank's role expanded beyond simple note issuance into active management of the entire monetary system. The foundation for that expanded authority rested on the monopoly secured during the long battle to eliminate competing currencies and establish banknotes as the only true money the nation recognized. The winter of 1825 brought Britain to the edge of financial catastrophe. What began as anxiety in the markets spiraled into full panic within days, as banks across the country faced runs that threatened to drain their reserves completely. Depositors lined up outside bank doors demanding gold for their paper notes, and many institutions simply could not meet these demands. The crisis revealed how fragile confidence remained even decades after the Bank of England had established its dominance over the monetary system. The panic originated in speculation that had inflated beyond sustainable levels, as easy credit during the preceding years had fueled investments in Latin American mining ventures, canal projects, and various commercial enterprises of dubious merit. When some of these ventures failed, creditors began calling in loans, forcing borrowers to sell assets to raise cash. These sales depressed prices, causing other investments to appear shaky, which prompted more loan recalls and a cascading spiral of fear. Country banks found themselves caught in an impossible position. They had issued notes and made loans based on reserves that seemed adequate during calm times, but proved woefully insufficient when panic struck. Depositors who had trusted these banks now demanded immediate repayment, but the banks had lent their reserves to borrowers who could not instantly repay. The fundamental fragility of fractional reserve banking revealed itself with brutal clarity. Dozens of banks failed within weeks. Their notes became worthless paper, wiping out the savings of thousands who had accepted these currencies in good faith. Businesses that relied on credit found themselves unable to secure loans at any price, forcing them to curtail operations or close entirely. Unemployment rose as factories reduced production. The social fabric strained as families faced sudden destitution through no fault of their own. The Bank of England initially responded to the crisis with caution that bordered on indifference. The institution had weathered previous disturbances and saw the failures of country banks as just punishment for reckless lending. Some directors even welcomed the collapse of competitors, viewing it as an opportunity to strengthen the bank's dominant position. This attitude reflected the institution's continued focus on private profit despite its increasingly public role. Yet, as the panic deepened and threatened to spread throughout the entire financial system, the bank recognized that inaction posed dangers to its own interests. If the banking system collapsed completely, even the Bank of England would suffer. The network of credit relationships that connected all financial institutions meant that widespread failures would eventually impact even the strongest banks. Reluctantly, the bank shifted from passive observation to active intervention. The bank expanded its lending to solvent institutions facing temporary liquidity problems. It purchased good securities that banks needed to sell to raise cash, preventing fire sales that would have further depressed asset prices. Most crucially, it issued additional notes to meet the desperate demand for currency. Recognizing that an artificial shortage of money was strangling commerce and deepening the crisis. This response came late and grudgingly, but it proved effective enough to halt the downward spiral. The panic slowly subsided as people gained confidence that currency would remain available and that sound banks would survive. The economy began to recover, though the scars from failed institutions and lost savings would take years to heal fully. The crisis prompted serious questions about the banking system and the Bank of England's responsibilities within it. Critics argued that the bank should have acted earlier and more decisively to prevent the panic from developing. They pointed out that an institution enjoying legal privileges and monopoly powers bore obligations beyond simply maximizing shareholder returns. The bank's hesitant response had allowed suffering that swifter action might have prevented. These debates continued for nearly 2 decades, culminating in the Bank Charter Act of 1844. This legislation represented Parliament's attempt to reform the monetary system and clarified the bank's role and limitations. The Act's architect, Robert Peel, believed that restricting the note issue according to strict rules would prevent future crises by ensuring that paper currency remained firmly anchored to gold reserves. The Act divided the bank into 2 departments, the issue department and the banking department, each with separate functions and accounting. The issue department would handle all note creation, which could only occur when backed pound for pound by gold or by a fixed quantity of government debt. This rigid rule aimed to prevent the bank from expanding the currency supply excessively. As Peel and his supporters believed such expansion had contributed to past instability. The banking department would conduct ordinary banking operations, accepting deposits and managing the government's accounts. It would operate subject to the same constraints as any other bank, without special privileges to create money beyond what the issue department authorized. In theory, this separation would prevent the bank from using its monopoly position to expand credit irresponsibly. The Act achieved some of its intended goals. It provided clear rules for currency issuance and reduced the discretion that had previously allowed the bank to make potentially destabilizing decisions. The linkage between notes and gold reserves gave the currency visible backing that helped maintain public confidence. For those who believed monetary problems stemmed from excessive creation of unbacked paper, the Act appeared to offer an elegant solution. Yet, the Act also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern banking and credit functioned. Restricting note issuance did not actually limit the money supply in the way Peel imagined. Banks could expand credit through deposits and loans without issuing physical notes. The economy needed flexibility in the currency supply to accommodate seasonal variations in demand and unexpected shocks. But the Act's rigid rules prevented the bank from providing this flexibility. The deficiencies of the Act became apparent during subsequent crises. In 1847, 1857, and 1866, financial panics struck that required the bank to expand its lending beyond what the Act permitted. Each time, Parliament had to suspend the Act's provisions to allow the bank to meet the emergency. These suspensions proved that the theoretical elegance of fixed rules collapsed when confronted with the messy reality of financial panic. A different approach to understanding the bank's proper role emerged from the writings of Walter Bagehot, a journalist and economist who observed these crises carefully. In his influential work, published in the 1870s, Bagehot articulated principles that would guide central banking for generations. He argued that, during panics, the bank should lend freely to solvent institutions against good collateral, but at penalty interest rates. This doctrine of lending freely in a crisis represented a more sophisticated understanding than the rigid rules of the 1844 Act. Bagehot recognized that panics stemmed from liquidity shortages rather than genuine insolvency in most cases. Banks holding good assets still faced runs because depositors feared they could not access their money when needed. If a credible lender stood ready to provide cash against those good assets, the panic would subside before causing unnecessary failures. The penalty interest rate served multiple purposes. It ensured that banks would only seek emergency lending when truly necessary rather than treating the facility as a source of cheap credit. It also provided some protection for the bank against losses and maintained the principle that emergency assistance should not reward reckless behavior. Banks that managed their affairs prudently would not need to pay penalty rates, while those requiring emergency loans would face consequences for their poor planning. Bagehot understood that the Bank of England occupied a unique position in the financial system. Whether its directors wished it or not, other institutions looked to the bank as the ultimate source of liquidity. This position carried responsibilities that transcended the interests of shareholders. The bank could not simply act as another profit-seeking corporation because its decisions affected the entire economy. This realization marked a crucial turning point in thinking about the bank's nature and purpose. The institution was evolving from a private company that happened to hold government debt into something closer to a true central bank with public responsibilities. The transformation occurred gradually and incompletely, resisted by directors who cherished the bank's private character and the profits it generated. Yet, crisis after crisis demonstrated that the old model could not persist unchanged. Each panic revealed that the financial system required an institution willing and able to provide stability when market forces alone produced chaos. The bank possessed the resources in position to play this role, but doing so required prioritizing systemic stability over short-term profit. The tension between private ownership and public function became increasingly untenable as the 19th century progressed. Shareholders expected dividends and opposed actions that might reduce profitability, even when those actions served broader social interests. The bank's directors struggled to balance these competing demands, sometimes successfully, but often in ways that satisfied neither shareholders nor critics. Reform proposals circulated regularly in Parliament and the press. Some advocated full nationalization, converting the bank into a government agency accountable to elected officials. Others suggested stricter regulations on the bank's operations while preserving its private ownership. Still others defended the status quo, arguing that the bank's independence from government control provided valuable protection against political interference in monetary policy. These debates never produced fundamental restructuring during the 19th century. The bank remained private in ownership and public in function, an awkward hybrid that reflected the difficulty of changing an institution so deeply embedded in the financial system. The forces favoring preservation of existing arrangements proved stronger than those demanding transformation. Yet, the intellectual foundation for eventual nationalization was being laid through. The gradual recognition that monetary control could not appropriately rest in private hands pursuing private interests. Baja and others articulated principles that assumed the bank would act in the public interest during crises, but the institution's private structure provided no mechanism to ensure such behavior. This contradiction would eventually force resolution, though not for many decades. The experience of 19th century crises also revealed patterns that would repeat in later eras. Financial systems proved inherently unstable, prone to swings between excessive optimism and desperate panic. Markets could not regulate themselves perfectly. Interconnections between institutions meant that failures cascaded through the system. Human psychology, with its alternating greed and fear, created cycles that no mechanical rules could prevent. The bank's gradual acceptance of its role as lender of last resort represented adaptation to these realities. The institution learned through painful experience that allowing widespread bank failures damaged everyone, including the bank itself. Providing emergency liquidity during panics served the bank's long-term interests, even when it required short-term sacrifices. This learning process occurred unevenly and incompletely. Different governors and directors held varying views about the bank's obligations. Political pressures and public opinion influenced decisions in ways that were not always consistent or predictable. The bank's policies evolved through trial and error rather than through any systematic planning. By the final decades of the 19th century, the bank had transformed considerably from its origins as a scheme to fund war. It had become the dominant financial institution in Britain, controlling the currency supply, serving as a banker to the government, and exercising enormous influence over economic conditions. Its private ownership remained, but its public functions had expanded far beyond what the founders could have imagined. The crises and reforms of the 19th century established patterns and principles that would carry forward into the modern era. The recognition that financial systems required institutions capable of providing stability in emergencies. The understanding that rigid rules could not accommodate the flexibility needed to respond to unexpected shocks. the gradual acceptance that private profit and public responsibility must somehow be balanced. All of these insights emerge from the difficult experiences of that transformative century. The Bank of England stood at a crossroads, neither fully private nor fully public, carrying enormous responsibilities while answering primarily to shareholders. This awkward position would persist through world wars and depression, through the collapse of empire and the emergence of new economic realities. The fundamental questions raised in the 19th century about who should control money and for whose benefit remained unresolved, waiting for future generations to confront them with renewed urgency. The summer of 1914 shattered the illusion that economic interdependence made war between major powers impossible. When the guns began firing across Europe, the Bank of England faced challenges that dwarfed anything in its previous history. The conflict that followed would consume resources on a scale that no one had imagined possible, and would fundamentally alter the relationship between the bank, the government, and the British economy. The immediate crisis arrived even before formal declarations of war. Foreign creditors rushed to convert their London assets into gold and ship it abroad, fearing that war would trap their wealth in enemy territory. British citizens hoarded gold coins, creating a shortage of currency for ordinary transactions. Banks faced runs as depositors demanded their money. The entire financial system teetered on the edge of collapse as panic swept through markets. The bank responded with extraordinary measures that revealed how completely its public function had overtaken its private character. It worked with the Treasury to declare a bank holiday, closing financial institutions to prevent runs from draining reserves. Parliament rushed through legislation, making banknotes legal tender for all debts, removing the previous restriction to large denominations. Most significantly, the government suspended the gold standard, breaking the link between currency and precious metal that had supposedly anchored the entire system. These actions represented a radical departure from the principles that had governed British finance for generations. The gold standard had been treated almost as a natural law, a foundation too fundamental to question. Abandoning it seemed like abandoning rationality itself. Yet the demands of war made such abandonment necessary. The government needed to mobilize resources without the constraints that gold convertibility imposed. With the gold standard suspended, the bank could create currency to fund the war effort without worrying about maintaining sufficient reserves to redeem notes. The quantity of money in circulation expanded dramatically as the government borrowed enormous sums. This monetary expansion allowed Britain to arm and equip millions of soldiers, build vast quantities of weapons and supplies, and sustain a war effort that consumed roughly half the national income at its peak. The mechanisms for financing this expenditure operated largely hidden from public view. The bank purchased government bonds, paying for them by crediting the Treasury's account. These credits did not represent existing money being moved from one place to another. Rather, they constituted new money created through bookkeeping entries. The bank simply recorded that the government now had millions of pounds it could spend, and those pounds came into existence through that recording. This process, sometimes called monetizing government debt, allowed spending to expand far beyond what taxation alone could support. The government raised taxes substantially, but the revenues still covered only a portion of war costs. The remainder came from borrowing, much of it ultimately from the bank itself through this mechanism of monetary creation. The nation was printing money to fund the war, though the process remained sufficiently technical and obscure that most people did not grasp what was happening. Inflation inevitably resulted from this monetary expansion. Prices rose steadily throughout the war as more currency chased a shrinking supply of civilian goods. Workers found their wages buying less, even as their employers profited from war contracts. Savers watched the real value of their deposits erode. The elderly living on fixed incomes faced genuine hardship as the cost of necessities climbed beyond their means to pay. Yet this inflation served the government's purposes by functioning as a hidden tax. The newly created money diluted the value of existing currency, effectively transferring purchasing power from the general population to the state. People surrendered real resources to the war effort through this mechanism, even when they paid no explicit taxes. Kie's creation of currency made this transfer possible while obscuring the true cost of the conflict. The bank's role extended beyond simply creating money for government spending. It managed the complex logistics of financing Britain's allies and purchasing supplies from neutral countries. Gold flowed between vaults in carefully guarded shipments as the bank settled international accounts. The institution coordinated with the newly created Federal Reserve in America to ensure that credit remained available and that exchange rates stayed within manageable bounds. These operations required cooperation and coordination that transformed the bank from an institution focused on domestic concerns into a player in global finance on an unprecedented scale. The governor of the bank communicated directly with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister, participating in decisions that shaped not just economic policy, but overall war strategy. The boundary between the bank and the government blurred almost to invisibility. When the war finally ended in 1918, Britain faced economic devastation despite its military victory. The national debt had grown two dimensions that seemed almost unpayable. The economy had been distorted by war production, with crucial industries neglected and others overdeveloped beyond any peacetime need. Millions of men returned from the trenches expecting jobs that did not exist. Social unrest threatened as disillusionment with the war's costs spread through all classes. The government and the bank agreed that restoring the gold standard should be a priority, viewing it as essential for reestablishing Britain's position as the center of global finance. Yet the process of returning to gold proved extraordinarily painful. It required reducing the money supply and forcing deflation to bring prices back in line with the pre-war gold value of the pound. This deflation meant falling wages, rise in unemployment, and widespread business failures. The return to gold in 1925 occurred at the pre-war parity, a decision driven more by national pride than economic logic. Maintaining the pound's traditional value relative to gold seemed to demonstrate that Britain remained a great power despite the war's costs. Yet, this decision required an overvalued currency that made British exports expensive and uncompetitive in world markets. Industries struggled, particularly coal mining and textiles, leading to labor unrest that culminated in the general strike of 1926. The bank pursued these deflationary policies despite their harsh social consequences. The institution's leaders believed that restoring financial orthodoxy required sacrifice and that short-term pain would yield long-term benefits. Critics argued that the bank was defending the interests of creditors and bondholders at the expense of its workers and productive enterprises. The debate reflected deeper disagreements about whether financial stability or full employment should take priority. The gold standard lasted barely 6 years before collapsing again during the Great Depression. As economic crisis spread globally in the early 1930s, countries abandoned gold one after another to regain monetary flexibility. Britain left the gold standard in 1931, allowing the pound to depreciate and monetary policy to focus on domestic recovery rather than maintaining an artificial external value. The brief return to gold came to be seen as a costly mistake that prolonged economic distress unnecessarily. These experiences between the wars demonstrated that the old financial order had broken irretrievably. The gold standard, which had seemed as permanent as the solar system, proved to be merely a human arrangement that could not survive modern economic pressures. The bank's pretense of independence from government became impossible to maintain when national survival required coordinated monetary and fiscal policy. The institution remained formally private, but its actions were directed increasingly by political imperatives. The approach of a Second World War in the late 1930s found the bank preparing for another extended conflict. The lessons of the First World War had been absorbed, and planning began early to mobilize financial resources for sustained warfare. This time, the break from gold occurred smoothly because no one maintained illusions about returning to 19th century monetary arrangements. The bank would create whatever money the war effort required. The Second World War pushed the bank's integration with the state to absolute completion. The institution operated effectively as an arm of the Treasury, implementing policies dictated by government ministers rather than chosen independently by bank directors. Capital controls restricted the movement of money across borders. Interest rates were set to facilitate government borrowing rather than to manage economic conditions. The bank served the war effort without regard for shareholder interests. Gold reserves took on crucial strategic importance during this conflict. The bank moved its gold stocks from London to secret locations in Wales and Canada to protect them from German bombing raids. Shipments crossed the Atlantic under military escort, representing not just financial assets, but a store of value that could be used to purchase American supplies before the United States entered the war. The gold vaults became targets as important as munitions factories. Some gold movements during this period remained shrouded in mystery, even decades later. Accounts speak of nighttime transfers, of trains carrying precious metals under armed guard, of vaults constructed in remote locations whose existence was known only to a handful of officials. The bank's archives contain gaps in the records from these years, whether from wartime security or from deliberate subsequent concealment. No one can definitively say. The bank also played a crucial role in managing the occupied territories' gold reserves. As Nazi Germany conquered nation after nation, it seized gold holdings and transferred them to accounts in neutral countries. The Bank of England, working with intelligence services, attempted to track these movements and prevent the Nazis from using stolen gold to purchase supplies from neutral nations. These efforts mixed finance with espionage in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Britain emerged from the Second World War economically exhausted, but militarily victorious. The national debt had reached levels that made the First World War's borrowing seem modest. The empire was crumbling as colonies demanded independence. The country depended on American aid to avoid complete economic collapse. The old world of British financial supremacy had ended definitively, though the institutions built in that era persisted. The Bank of England in 1945 bore little resemblance to the private company created in 1694. It had become an instrument of state policy, operating under government direction to serve public purposes. The shareholders still technically owned the institution and received dividends, but everyone recognized these as formalities that no longer reflected reality. The bank had been nationalized in practice, if not yet in law. The wartime experience conclusively demonstrated that monetary control could not be left to private interests during national emergencies. The creation of money, the setting of interest rates, the management of public debt, all of these had been directed by elected officials to serve war aims. The pretense that the bank operated independently and pursued its own objectives had become unsustainable. Yet the formal structure remained unchanged, creating an awkward situation where the bank's legal status as a private corporation contradicted its function as a government agency. This contradiction would need to be resolved now that the emergency of war had passed. The question was not whether the bank would remain private in practice, which seemed impossible, but whether its legal form would finally be brought into alignment with its public responsibilities. The debate over nationalization that unfolded in the immediate post-war years thus concerned not whether the bank should serve public purposes, which all sides accepted, but whether formal government ownership was necessary or desirable. Defenders of private ownership argued that some degree of independence protected monetary policy from short-term political pressures. Critics responded that democratic accountability required that such powerful institutions answer to elected representatives rather than to shareholders. The hidden history of the bank's role in two world wars revealed an institution transformed by necessity from a profit-seeking company into an essential tool of state power. The gold moved secretly through the night, the currency created to fund massive armies, the cooperation with intelligence services and military planners. All of this occurred behind a facade of private banking that had become a fiction maintained only because no one had taken the final step of making the nationalization explicit. That step would come soon, bringing the bank's legal form into alignment with its long-established reality. But the transformation had already occurred during the terrible crucible of total war. The Bank of England that emerged from 1945 was a public institution serving public purposes. Regardless of what the old charter from 1694 might technically still say, the Labour government that came to power in 1945 carried a mandate for radical transformation of British society. Nationalization of key industries formed a central pillar of their program, and the Bank of England stood near the top of the list. In 1946, Parliament passed legislation that transferred ownership of the bank from private shareholders to the state, ending more than 2.5 centuries of private control over what had long since become a public institution in all but name. The nationalization proceeded with surprising smoothness and little genuine controversy. Shareholders received compensation at generous rates that ensured they lost nothing from the transfer. The existing governor and directors remained in their positions, providing continuity that some found reassuring and others found troubling. The operational structure of the bank continued unchanged, with the same departments performing the same functions under the same leadership. Critics of nationalization had warned of disaster, predicting that political control would destroy the bank's credibility and lead to reckless monetary policies. These fears proved groundless, largely because the change in ownership altered remarkably little about how the bank actually operated. The institution maintained its traditional practices and its culture of secrecy. The faces around the table at court meetings remained largely the same, drawn from the same elite circles of finance and aristocracy. What had changed was the formal ownership structure, but what remained unchanged was nearly everything else. The governor still enjoyed enormous autonomy in conducting the bank's affairs. The Treasury could issue directives, but in practice, these came rarely and were negotiated rather than imposed. The bank retained effective control over monetary policy, interest rates, and the myriad technical decisions that shaped financial conditions throughout the economy. The persistence of private influence became evident when examining who continued to guide the bank after nationalization. The Court of Directors, though now appointed by the government rather than elected by shareholders, still consisted overwhelmingly of individuals from the City of London financial community. Merchant bankers, insurance executives, and industrial magnates filled seats that ostensibly represented the public interest, but actually embodied the perspectives of private capital. These individuals brought with them connections to the very institutions the bank was supposed to regulate and guide. A director might serve on the board while simultaneously holding positions at major commercial banks or investment firms. The potential for conflicts of interest seemed obvious, yet the system relied on the assumption that gentlemen of good character would naturally place public duty above private advantage. Whether this assumption reflected reality or convenient fiction remained a question rarely examined too closely. The revolving door between the bank and private finance spun continuously throughout the post-war decades. Senior bank officials retired into lucrative positions at merchant banks or investment houses. Rising stars from the city received appointments to influential roles within the bank. This circulation of personnel between public institution and private firms created relationships and mindsets that blurred the distinction between serving the nation and serving the financial sector. Defenders of this arrangement argued that the bank required expertise that only came from practical experience in finance. They claimed that individuals who had never worked in banking could not possibly understand the complexities of monetary policy and financial regulation. This logic seemed reasonable on its surface, but ignored how it concentrated power among a narrow class sharing similar backgrounds, educations, and interests. The culture within the bank reinforced these patterns of elite continuity. The institution valued discretion, technical expertise, and what it considered sound judgment, qualities interpreted in ways that favored those from particular backgrounds. The bank recruited from Oxford and Cambridge, preferring candidates whose fathers or uncles had worked in the city. This self-perpetuating system ensured that nationalization changed ownership without changing who actually controlled the institution. International relationships during the Cold War drew the bank into activities that extended far beyond simple monetary management. The division of the world into capitalist and communist blocs meant that financial flows carried geopolitical significance. The bank participated in coordinating Western monetary policy, working closely with the Federal Reserve and European central banks to maintain stability in non-communist economies and to project financial power as a tool of Cold War competition. These international operations often occurred in shadows where public accountability barely penetrated. The Bank for International Settlements, established in the 1930s, provided a venue where central bankers met to coordinate policy away from political oversight. Representatives from the Bank of England joined colleagues from other Western nations in Basel, Switzerland, making decisions that affected billions of people without those people having any voice in the process. The discussions that occurred in Basel ranged across technical monetary questions, but they also touched on matters of high politics and strategy. How should Western central banks respond to Soviet economic initiatives? What monetary arrangements would best support American military spending abroad? How could capital be prevented from flowing to socialist countries? These questions mixed economics with ideology in ways that revealed how thoroughly the banks had become enmeshed in Cold War structures. The bank's cooperation with intelligence services deepened during this period, though the details remain largely classified even decades later. Financial intelligence regarding communist countries' foreign exchange reserves, their gold holdings, and their international trading relationships flowed through the bank. The institution tracked unusual currency movements that might indicate espionage, funding, or arms purchases. In some cases, the bank apparently participated in economic warfare designed to destabilize hostile regimes. These activities bore no resemblance to the public image of a nationalized institution, serving the British people's interests. The bank operated in a twilight realm where finance and statecraft merged, where technical expertise provided cover for political operations, where unelected officials made decisions with profound consequences for international relations. Nationalization had done nothing to illuminate these shadows or subject them to democratic scrutiny. The management of Britain's gold and foreign currency reserves illustrated how nationalization failed to bring meaningful transparency. The bank held these reserves and managed them according to policies known only to a small circle of officials. Public information about the size and composition of reserves emerged intermittently and often proved incomplete or misleading. The bank maintained that secrecy protected the nation's interests, but it also protected the institution from accountability. Questions arose periodically about whether the reserves were being managed optimally or whether losses had occurred through poor judgment or worse. The bank deflected such inquiries with technical arguments and appeals to the need for confidentiality. Without access to detailed information, critics found it impossible to evaluate the bank's performance or identify problems. The veil of secrecy that had characterized the bank as a private institution persisted unchanged after it became publicly owned. The relationship between the bank and the Treasury evolved into a complex dance where formal authority often diverged from practical power. Legally, the Treasury could direct the bank on any matter. In reality, such directions came rarely because the bank's expertise and its control over technical knowledge gave it effective veto power over policies it opposed. A chancellor of the exchequer might propose a course of action, only to be told by the bank that it was impractical or dangerous. This dynamic meant that elected officials often found themselves constrained by unelected bank officials whose judgments reflected the orthodox views of the financial community rather than the policy preferences that had won democratic mandates. When the government of the day wanted expansionary policies to reduce unemployment, the bank warned of inflation and advocated restraint. When social spending threatened to increase public debt, the bank emphasized the importance of maintaining creditor confidence. The pattern revealed a fundamental tension that nationalization had not resolved. Democratic governments theoretically controlled monetary policy through their ownership of the bank, but the bank's institutional culture and its personnel's connections to private finance meant it frequently resisted policies that challenged financial orthodoxy. Public ownership had not translated into public control in any meaningful sense. International capital movements posed particular challenges during this era. Britain maintained capital controls for decades after the war, restricting the ability to move money across borders. The bank administered these controls, deciding which transactions to approve and which to deny. This power allowed the bank to favor certain industries or individuals while blocking others, creating opportunities for preferential treatment that operated below the threshold of public visibility. Stories circulated about prominent figures receiving approval for currency transfers that ordinary citizens would have been denied. Wealthy individuals found ways to move money abroad despite ostensible restrictions, often with the bank's tacit cooperation. Meanwhile, small businesses struggled to obtain the foreign exchange needed for legitimate trade. The system appeared to serve those with connections while constraining those without them. The gradual dismantling of capital controls during the 1970s and 1980s reflected not democratic decisions about economic policy, but rather the bank's judgment that controls had become unworkable and counterproductive. The institution advocated for liberalization based on technical arguments about efficiency and the impossibility of enforcement. These arguments had merit, but the decision to abandon controls carried enormous implications for economic policy that arguably deserved wider debate than occurred within the bank's restricted circles. Throughout the post-war decades, the fiction persisted that the bank operated as a neutral technical institution implementing policies decided by elected governments. The reality proved far more complex. The bank shaped which policies appeared feasible through its control over technical expertise and its ability to predict dire consequences for proposals it opposed. It influenced decisions through its international relationships and its cultivation for opinion among financial journalists and academic economists. This influence operated through mechanisms too subtle and dispersed to be called conspiracy, yet too consistent and consequential to be dismissed as coincidence. The bank recruited people who shared certain assumptions about economics and finance. It promoted those who demonstrated sound judgment as defined by orthodox thinking, maintained relationships with institutions and individuals who reinforced these perspectives. The result was a self-sustaining system that naturalized particular viewpoints while marginalizing alternatives. Nationalization had promised to bring the bank under democratic control and make it serve the public rather than private interests. These goals remained largely unrealized decades after the formal transfer of ownership. The institution had adapted to its new legal status while preserving its essential character. The same types of people made the same types of decisions in service of the same fundamental priorities, though now they did so as public servants rather than as representatives of shareholders. The question of whether this outcome represented betrayal of nationalization's promise or inevitable reality of central banking admitted no simple answer. Perhaps any institution wielding such technical power would naturally develop autonomy regardless of ownership structure. Perhaps the complexity of monetary policy truly required expertise that only certain backgrounds provided. Or perhaps nationalization had been deliberately structured to change as little as possible. satisfying demands for public ownership while ensuring that power remained in familiar hands. The bank's archives from this period contain suggestions of all these interpretations. Documents show genuine efforts to serve public purposes alongside evidence of continued private influence. Correspondence reveals both technical necessity, driving decisions, and political considerations, shaping outcomes. The truth, as usual, contained elements of multiple perspectives that simple narratives could not capture. What became undeniable was that nationalization alone had not solved the fundamental problems of concentrating such enormous power in a single institution. The Bank of England remained a hybrid creature, neither fully public nor entirely insulated from private interests, wielding authority that exceeded its accountability, making decisions that affected millions based on judgments formed within a narrow elite. The formal change in ownership had occurred in 1946, but the deeper transformation that might have made the bank genuinely serve the public interest remained incomplete and contested. The spring of 1997 arrived with an air of anticipation that seemed to hang over London like morning mist rising from the Thames. A new government had swept into power, carried by promises of change and modernization, and within days of taking office, the Chancellor of the Exchequer made an announcement that would reshape the relationship between political power and monetary authority. The Bank of England, after more than 3 centuries of existence and half a century under direct government control, would be granted operational independence. The news sent ripples through financial markets around the world, and commentators spoke of a new era dawning. Yet, beneath the surface of this historic declaration lay questions that few thought to ask in the heady atmosphere of reform. What did independence actually mean for an institution so deeply woven into the fabric of state power? The bank would now set interest rates free from political interference, or so the official narrative proclaimed. But the architecture of this independence revealed subtleties that deserved careful examination. The government would still determine the inflation target that the bank must pursue. The Treasury would retain ultimate authority during times of crisis. The governor and members of the new Monetary Policy Committee would be appointed by political figures. Independence, it seemed, came with invisible strings attached. The creation of the Monetary Policy Committee represented the most visible symbol of this new arrangement. 9 individuals would gather each month to determine the price of borrowing for an entire nation. Their decisions would ripple outward through mortgage payments and business loans, through pension funds and savings accounts, touching the lives of millions who would never know their names. The committee included the governor, 2 deputy governors, the chief economist, executive director for markets, and for external members drawn from academia and finance. This blend of internal expertise and outside perspective was meant to prevent groupthink and ensure diverse viewpoints shaped monetary policy. The meetings followed a careful choreography designed to project scientific precision and democratic deliberation. Members would receive briefings from bank staff examining economic data and forecasting models that attempted to predict the unpredictable. Each member held 1 vote, and the governor possessed no power to overrule the collective. Minutes would be published, revealing how each member voted, exposing their reasoning to public scrutiny. This transparency was presented as a break from the shadowy deliberations of the past, when interest rate decisions emerged from private conversations between governor and chancellor, their rationale hidden from view. But transparency can itself become a veil, revealing certain things while obscuring others. The models that informed committee decisions remained impenetrably complex to ordinary citizens. The assumptions built into economic forecasts carried ideological weight that few could discern. The very framework of inflation targeting presumed that stable prices should be the paramount goal of monetary policy, a choice that prioritized certain economic actors over others. Savers might benefit from low inflation, while those carrying debts might prefer prices to rise. The unemployed worker searching for jobs might have different priorities than the bondholder seeking stable returns. Yet these distributive choices were buried within technical discussions, presented as neutral expertise rather than political decisions. The early years of independence coincided with a period of unusual calm in the global economy. Inflation remained subdued, growth continued steadily, and the new framework appeared vindicated by results. The bank developed a reputation for competence and credibility. Its pronouncements followed closely by markets that hung on every word from Threadneedale Street. The governor became a public figure. His speeches dissected for hints about future policy directions. Financial journalists developed a cottage industry interpreting the subtle shadings of bank communications, searching for signals hidden within careful bureaucratic language. This extended period of stability bred confidence that bordered on hubris. The notion took hold that central bankers had finally cracked the code of economic management, that the violent cycles of boom and bust that had plagued earlier generations could now be smoothed into gentle undulations. The term Great Moderation entered the vocabulary, suggesting that mature economies, guided by independent central banks, had entered a new phase of perpetual equilibrium. The Bank of England participated in this collective delusion. Its models, suggesting risks, were well contained and financial innovations had distributed danger so widely that systemic threats had diminished. The first tremors of what would become the greatest financial crisis in generations arrived in the summer of 2007. A small British bank called Northern Rock had built its business on a model that seemed clever during calm times, but proved catastrophic when conditions shifted. Rather than funding mortgages through traditional deposits, Northern Rock borrowed heavily in wholesale markets, confident that short-term funds would always be available to roll over its debts. When those markets froze, as American subprime losses spread fear across global finance, Northern Rock found itself unable to meet its obligations. Queues formed outside branches as depositors rushed to withdraw their savings, the first bank run in Britain since Victorian times. The Bank of England initially hesitated, uncertain how to respond within its new framework of transparency and rule following. The governor expressed reluctance to provide emergency lending, fearing it would create moral hazard by rewarding reckless behavior. This hesitation allowed the crisis to escalate, transforming a problem at one institution into a systemic threat that endangered the entire banking system. Eventually, the bank was forced to act as lender of last resort, reviving a role it had not played in such dramatic fashion for over a century. Northern Rock was nationalized, its debts becoming obligations of the British state, its shareholders wiped out. The Northern Rock episode proved merely a prelude to catastrophe. When the American investment bank Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008, shockwaves radiated through every connected market on Earth. British banks that had seemed impregnable revealed themselves as houses of cards built on borrowed money. Royal Bank of Scotland, which had grown into one of the largest financial institutions in the world through aggressive acquisition and leverage, came within hours of complete collapse. The government was forced to inject billions of pounds into failing banks, effectively nationalizing much of the financial sector in everything but name. The Bank of England found itself at the center of a storm that exposed the limitations of its independence and the inadequacy of its toolkit. Interest rates, the primary weapon of monetary policy, proved impotent when markets ceased functioning. The bank slashed rates toward zero, yet credit remained frozen and economic activity collapsed. Something more dramatic was required, something that would have seemed unthinkable just months before. The answer came in the form of a policy with an anodyne name that disguised its revolutionary nature. Quantitative easing, the bank announced, would begin immediately. The mechanics of quantitative easing revealed the true nature of modern money in ways that most citizens had never contemplated. The Bank of England would create new money out of nothing, conjuring it into existence through electronic entries on its balance sheet. This newly created money would be used to purchase government bonds and other financial assets from banks and investors. The stated goal was to push down long-term interest rates and encourage lending, but the effects spread far beyond these technical objectives. Asset prices rose as newly created money chased limited investments. Those who owned stocks and property saw their wealth expand, while those without assets found the cost of buying a home or saving for retirement increasingly out of reach. The scale of this money creation eventually reached figures that strained comprehension. Hundreds of billions of pounds materialized from nothing, quantity that would have seemed like fantasy to the goldsmiths and merchants who first established the bank 3 centuries earlier. The bank insisted this was not simply printing money to fund government spending, though the practical effects bore uncomfortable resemblance to exactly that. Government bonds held by the bank generated interest payments that flowed back to the Treasury, effectively reducing the cost of public borrowing. The line between monetary and fiscal policy, between central bank independence and government financing, blurred beyond recognition. Critics from across the political spectrum raised alarms about these unprecedented interventions. Some warned of inflation that must surely follow such massive money creation. Others pointed to the distributional effects that enriched asset owners while doing little for ordinary workers. A few voices questioned whether central banks had exceeded their democratic mandate, making decisions with profound consequences for society without electoral accountability. The bank pressed forward, its officials insisting they were merely following their inflation targeting mandate using unconventional tools required by extraordinary circumstances. The years following the crisis brought neither the inflation feared by some nor the robust recovery hoped for by others. Instead, a strange new normal settled over the economy, characterized by near-zero interest rates that seemed unable to stimulate vigorous growth. The bank found itself trapped in a policy it could not easily exit. Each attempt to raise rates or reduce bond holdings, threatening to destabilize markets, grown dependent on central bank support. The notion of independence took on ironic shadings when the bank appeared captured by the very financial system it supposedly regulated. Meanwhile, the regulatory apparatus received a significant restructuring. The Financial Services Authority, which had failed so spectacularly to anticipate the crisis, was abolished and its responsibilities redistributed. The Bank of England gained new powers for financial stability, adding prudential regulation of banks and insurers to its monetary policy duties. This expansion of authority concentrated tremendous power within a single institution, raising questions about accountability and the dangers of regulatory capture. The bank was now responsible for the safety of the financial system it had failed to protect, setting interest rates for an economy it had failed to understand, and creating money at scales that would have horrified its founders. The response to the crisis also revealed the international dimensions of central bank power. The Bank of England coordinated closely with the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other monetary authorities. Their actions choreographed to prevent cascading failures across borders. Currency swap lines allowed dollars and euros and pounds to flow between central banks, creating a web of mutual support that operated largely outside democratic oversight. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel served as the club where these technocrats gathered, sharing views and coordinating policies away from public scrutiny. As the immediate crisis faded into memory, the bank settled into its new role as both monetary authority and financial regulator. The Monetary Policy Committee continued its monthly deliberations, setting interest rates according to models that had failed to predict catastrophe. A new Financial Policy Committee was created to monitor systemic risks, though its members drew heavily from the same circles that had overlooked dangers before. The institution that emerged from crisis was larger, more powerful, and more embedded in the financial system than at any point in its history. Yet, questions about its accountability and effectiveness remained unresolved. The bank's communication evolved in response to demands for greater openness. Yet, this transparency often obscured as much as it revealed. Press conferences and testimony before Parliament provided platforms for carefully scripted messages. Research papers and speeches offered dense technical analysis that specialists could parse, but ordinary citizens could not penetrate. The illusion of openness coexisted with persistent mysteries about how decisions were really made and whose interests they truly served. Independence had been achieved, but from what and for whom remained questions without clear answers. The connections that bind central banks together form a web that most citizens never see. Yet these relationships shape the financial architecture of the modern world. The Bank of England occupies a peculiar position within this network, ancient enough to claim precedence over younger institutions, yet integrated into a system that transcends national boundaries. Understanding these hidden linkages requires peering behind the formal structures of monetary cooperation into the informal bonds that truly determine how global finance operates. The relationship between the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve dates to the earliest days of American central banking. When the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, its architects studied the Bank of England carefully, borrowing concepts while adapting them to American circumstances. Benjamin Strong, the first leader of the powerful Federal Reserve Bank of New York, cultivated close ties with Montague Norman, the eccentric governor who dominated the Bank of England through the interwar years. These two men corresponded regularly, visited each other across the Atlantic, and coordinated their policies in ways that shaped the trajectory of the global economy. The friendship between Strong and Norman represented more than personal affinity. It established a pattern of central bank cooperation that operated outside formal diplomatic channels, creating what some observers called a shadow government of international finance. When Strong died in 1928, the loss destabilized the careful arrangements he had constructed. Some historians argue that the coordination failures following his death contributed to the severity of the Great Depression. As central banks retreated into narrow national concerns rather than maintaining the international cooperation that had characterized the previous decade, its legacy of personal relationships transcending institutional boundaries persists to the present day. Governors and chairmen continue to cultivate connections through regular meetings and informal consultations. The twice-monthly phone calls between the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve provide opportunities for coordination that never appear in official minutes. Joint statements during crises demonstrate the tight integration of policy responses. Yet the substance of private discussions remains hidden from public view. The elected officials who nominally oversee monetary policy in their respective countries exercise little control over these transnational relationships. The Bank for International Settlements in Basel serves as the institutional heart of central bank cooperation. Founded in 1932, managed German war reparations. The BIS evolved into something far more significant. Its headquarters in a circular tower overlooking the Rhine houses, the Central Bankers Club, a venue where the world's most powerful monetary authorities gathered to discuss matters far from public scrutiny. The Bank of England has been a member since the BIS's founding, its governors attending the bi-monthly meetings where informal consensus shapes global financial policy. The Basel meetings operate under a culture of absolute discretion that would be familiar to the private bankers of earlier centuries. For central bank governors dine together, share confidences, and develop the personal trust that enables coordination during crises. No minutes are published from these gatherings. No journalists observe the proceedings. The democratic accountability that modern central banks claim to embrace evaporates within the tower's curved walls. Decisions that affect billions of people emerge from conversations among a few dozen individuals whose names most citizens would not recognize. BIS also serves as a forum for developing the regulatory standards that govern global banking. The Basel Accords, which determine how much capital banks must hold against their risks, emerged from committees housed within this institution. These technical standards carry enormous consequences for economic activity, determining the availability and cost of credit across the world. Yet, their development proceeds through expert deliberations that few elected officials understand or monitor. The Bank of England participates actively in these processes, its representatives helping shape rules that bind British banks while operating largely beyond parliamentary oversight. The City of London itself constitutes another hidden dimension of the bank's power. This ancient square mile at the heart of the capital operates under arrangements that date back centuries, maintain a degree of autonomy that sets it apart from ordinary local government. The City of London Corporation, with its medieval ceremonies and arcane voting structures, gives businesses, rather than residents, primary influence over governance. Within this peculiar jurisdiction, the Bank of England sits as the center of a financial ecosystem with global reach. The special status of the city evolved through centuries of accumulated privilege, creating a regulatory environment uniquely favorable to financial activity. When empire faded and manufacturing declined, successive governments promoted the city as Britain's comparative advantage, a hub for international finance that would generate wealth even as other industries withered. The Bank of England's presence anchored this strategy, providing legitimacy and stability to a marketplace that attracted capital from around the world. Offshore arrangements, light regulation, and deep expertise made London a destination for money seeking discretion as much as returns. The boundaries between the bank and the private financial institutions it supposedly regulates often blur into invisibility. Career paths flow in both directions, as bank officials depart for lucrative positions in commercial banking, while industry veterans join the regulatory apparatus. This revolving door raises persistent questions about whose interests the bank truly serves. A regulator who anticipates a future career at Goldman Sachs or HSBC may approach oversight differently than one committed to public service alone. The relationships formed through these career movements create networks of mutual understanding that can shade into captured regulation. The Court of Directors, the governing body that oversees the bank's affairs, provides institutional expression of this interpenetration. Though nationalization in 1946 ended formal private ownership, the court continued to draw members from the commanding heights of British finance and industry. Bankers, industrialists, and business leaders populated its ranks, bringing perspectives shaped by commercial interests. The court's non-executive members were meant to provide outside scrutiny, yet their selection from the same narrow circles as bank leadership ensured a fundamental alignment of worldview. These connections extend into the realm of ideas as well as institutions. The bank employs economists trained in the same graduate programs as their counterparts at private banks and academic departments. They share theoretical frameworks, attend the same conferences, and publish in the same journals. This intellectual homogeneity means that certain assumptions about how economies work permeate both regulatory and commercial spheres. Alternative perspectives that might challenge the consensus struggle to gain purchase when everyone in positions of influence has absorbed similar training. The financial crisis exposed these interlocking relationships in uncomfortable ways. The bank's failure to anticipate catastrophe reflected not just analytical errors, but the difficulty of questioning a system in which one is deeply embedded. The same institutions that later required massive public support had populated the advisory committees, working groups through which the bank developed policy. The same executives who nearly destroyed the economy have been celebrated as masters of financial innovation by a regulatory establishment that shared their assumptions. Conspiracy theories about central banking have circulated for as long as central banks have existed. Some imagine shadowy cabals of international bankers manipulating currencies and governments for private gain. Others see central banks as instruments of a hidden aristocracy, perpetuating privilege behind a facade of public service. The Bank of England features prominently in these narratives, its ancient origins and mysterious operations providing fertile ground for speculation. The Rothschild family, with their genuine historical connections to British finance, appears in countless theories attributing superhuman powers of coordination and control. Separating documented facts from fevered imagination requires careful attention to evidence. The reality is that central banks do coordinate their policies, but through prosaic mechanisms rather than occult conspiracies. Personal relationships among governors, institutional venues like the BIS, and shared theoretical frameworks produce alignment without requiring secret societies. The concentration of power within central banking is real and consequential, but it operates through bureaucratic processes rather than midnight rituals. Understanding actual mechanisms of influence proves more illuminating than chasing phantoms. Yet, the grain of truth within conspiracy theories deserves acknowledgement. Central banks do operate with significant insulation from democratic accountability. Their decisions do favor certain interests over others. The networks connecting central bankers to private finance do create potential for conflicts of interest. The secrecy surrounding international coordination does prevent meaningful public oversight. These documented realities provide rational grounds for concern, even without invoking elaborate conspiracies. The mundane concentration of monetary power among a small technocratic elite poses genuine questions for democratic governance. The Bank of England's relationships with other central banks intensified following the 2008 crisis. The extraordinary measures deployed during those desperate months required coordination across borders that made earlier cooperation seem casual. Currency swap lines established between the bank, the Federal Reserve, and other central banks created channels for dollar liquidity that kept global finance functioning. These arrangements have since become permanent fixtures of the international monetary system, institutionalizing connections that once depended on personal relationships alone. The European dimension of the bank's relationships deserves particular attention. Before Brexit, the bank participated in European frameworks for financial regulation and banking supervision. The departure from the European Union severed some of these institutional ties while leaving informal connections largely intact. Bank officials continue to engage with their European counterparts, recognizing that financial markets respect no borders and crises spread faster than diplomatic protocols can respond. The post-Brexit settlement for financial services remains contested, with the bank navigating between regulatory autonomy and market access. Academic economists who study central banking often emphasize the technical dimensions of monetary policy while downplaying the political economy that shapes institutional behavior. That the Bank of England cannot be understood apart from the power relations in which it is embedded. Its policies affect the distribution of wealth and income, determining winners and losers in ways that carry profound political significance. The pretense of technical neutrality obscures choices that deserve democratic deliberation. Independence from elected government does not mean independence from all interests, merely a different configuration of influence. The networks surrounding the bank extend into media and public discourse. Financial journalists cultivate sources within Threadneedle Street, their access dependent on maintaining relationships that constrain critical coverage. The bank's communications apparatus shapes narratives about monetary policy, framing issues in ways that favor institutional perspectives. Think tanks funded by financial industry donors produce research that often aligns with bank priorities. These mechanisms of influence operate subtly, requiring no explicit coordination to produce sympathetic coverage and limited scrutiny. The ordinary citizen attempting to understand the Bank of England confronts layers of complexity designed to discourage engagement. Technical jargon renders policy discussions inaccessible. Historical narratives emphasize institutional wisdom while minimizing failures. The mystique of expertise suggests that monetary policy lies beyond democratic competence. These barriers serve to insulate the bank from the accountability that other public institutions face. The hidden connections that link central banks to private finance and to each other remain hidden precisely because their exposure might invite unwelcome questions about power and its exercise. Understanding these networks does not require embracing paranoid narratives of total control. Central bankers are not all-seeing or all-powerful. They make mistakes, face genuine uncertainties, and often find their policies producing unexpected results. The complexity of modern finance exceeds any individual or institution's capacity to fully comprehend or control. But recognizing these limitations should not obscure the very real power that central banks wield, or the problematic ways that power connects to private interests. The Bank of England operates within webs of relationship that deserve scrutiny, even if they fall short of conspiracy. The question of reform remains perpetually on the agenda, yet perpetually deferred. Proposals for greater transparency, stronger accountability, or different institutional structures circulate through academic and policy debates without gaining traction. The interests served by current arrangements possess the resources and influence to resist meaningful change. The technical complexity of central banking discourages political engagement, and the ideology of central bank independence, whatever its original justifications, now functions to shield monetary policy from democratic challenge. The hidden connections persist because they serve those who benefit from keeping them hidden. The Bank of England today stands at the intersection of forces that would have bewildered its founders. Yet the fundamental questions about money and power that animated its creation remain stubbornly unresolved. 3 centuries have transformed a wartime financing scheme into a sprawling institution that touches nearly every aspect of British economic life. The governors who once convened in coffee houses now preside over operations spanning monetary policy, financial regulation, banknote production, and systemic risk monitoring. Yet, for all this accumulated authority, the bank faces challenges that expose the limits of central bank power in an interconnected world. The contemporary influence of the bank extends far beyond the technical adjustments to interest rates that dominate headlines. Every mortgage payment in Britain carries the imprint of decisions made on Threadneedle Street. The pension funds holding the retirement savings of millions respond to signals emanating from the Monetary Policy Committee. Small businesses seeking loans discover that their fates connect to judgments about inflation and growth made by economists they will never meet. The currency in wallets and the numbers in bank accounts derive their value from confidence that the bank works tirelessly to maintain. This pervasive influence operates so smoothly when functioning well that most people never notice its presence. It's becoming visible only when something goes wrong. The financial crisis and its aftermath fundamentally alter the bank's relationship to the broader economy. The massive expansion of its balance sheet through quantitative easing made the institution a dominant holder of government debt and a significant presence in corporate bond markets. This ownership position creates entanglements that complicate the bank's regulatory role. How can an institution objectively assess risks in markets where its own interventions have distorted prices beyond recognition? The pretense of arm's-length supervision strains credibility when the supervisor has become one of the largest participants in the markets it oversees. Inflation's return in the years following global disruptions tested the bank's credibility in ways not seen for decades. After years of struggling to push inflation up toward target, policymakers suddenly confronted the opposite problem as prices surged beyond anything their models had predicted. The institution that had defined itself through inflation targeting found its signature achievement slipping away. Public confidence, carefully cultivated through decades of apparent competence, eroded as households watched their purchasing power diminish while the bank's responses seemed always a step behind events. The distributional consequences of monetary policy have become increasingly difficult to ignore. The extended period of ultra-low interest rates transferred wealth from savers to borrowers, from the old to the young with mortgages, from those without assets to those whose property and portfolios appreciated. When inflation arrived, those without bargaining power to secure wage increases suffered most acutely. The fiction that monetary policy operates as a neutral, technocratic exercise, affecting aggregate variables without favoring particular groups, collapsed under the weight of observable reality. The bank found itself drawn into political controversies it had long sought to avoid. Digital currencies represent perhaps the most profound challenge facing the bank as it contemplates its future. The emergence of Bitcoin and its proliferating imitators demonstrated that money need not depend on central bank blessing. These decentralized systems promise to bypass traditional financial intermediaries entirely, transferring value across borders without permission from any authority. While their volatility and limitations prevented widespread adoption for everyday transactions, the underlying technology opened possibilities that central bankers could not ignore. The Bank of England has responded by exploring its own digital currency, central bank digital currency that would represent a claim on the institution itself rather than a promise from a commercial bank. This prospect carries revolutionary implications concealed beneath technical discussions of payment systems and financial infrastructure. A digital pound issued directly by the bank would allow the institution to observe transactions with unprecedented granularity, potentially monitoring economic activity in real time. The privacy implications trouble civil liberties advocates who envision surveillance capabilities that would make historical authorities envious. Proponents argue that central bank digital currency could enhance financial inclusion, reaching those excluded from traditional banking while reducing the costs of payment processing. The efficiency gains from instantaneous settlement could benefit businesses and consumers alike. The bank could implement monetary policy more directly, even applying different interest rates to different forms of money or programming currencies to expire, not spent within certain periods. These capabilities, presented as innovations, would grant the monetary authority powers that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The design choices embedded in any digital currency will shape economic relationships for generations. Whether the bank allows anonymous transactions or requires full identification, whether it permits unlimited holdings or caps individual balances, whether it enables programmable restrictions or maintains fungibility, each decision carries consequences that extend far beyond technical efficiency. The consultations and pilot programs currently underway will determine the monetary infrastructure of the future. Yet public engagement with these fundamental questions remains minimal. The engineers and economists designing these systems operate with little democratic input on the values their creations should embody. Climate change has emerged as another frontier where the bank's responsibilities are expanding in controversial directions. The recognition that environmental catastrophe poses risks to financial stability has drawn central banks into territory once considered far beyond their mandate. The Bank of England has undertaken stress tests examining how climate scenarios might affect banks and insurers. It has published expectations for how financial institutions should manage climate-related risks. Some argue it should go further, using its balance sheet to support green investments while penalizing carbon-intensive activities. The integration of climate considerations into monetary policy raises profound questions about central bank mandates. If the bank adjusts its bond purchases to favor green issuers, it makes judgments about which economic activities deserve support that seem properly political rather than technical. If it imposes climate-related capital requirements on banks, it influences the allocation of credit in ways that affect real economic decisions. Supporters argue that recognizing climate risk simply extends traditional financial stability concerns to their logical conclusion. Critics worry that mission creep will compromise the bank's independence by entangling it in contested political debates. The Network for Greening the Financial System, an international grouping of central banks addressing climate issues, counts the Bank of England among its founding members. Through this forum, monetary authorities coordinate approaches to climate risk disclosure, stress testing methodologies, and supervisory expectations. The familiar pattern of central bank cooperation, operating through technical networks beyond democratic oversight, reproduces itself in this new domain. The transition to sustainable finance, whatever its merits, proceeds through channels that citizens can barely perceive, let alone influence. These expansions of central bank authority arrive without corresponding expansions of accountability. The Bank of England answers to Parliament through occasional testimony and reports, yet the complexity of its activities defeats meaningful scrutiny. Members of Parliament lack the technical expertise to challenge bank assessments, while the press rarely penetrates beyond official narratives. The independence granted in 1997 has evolved into something approaching autonomy, with the bank determining not just how to pursue its mandates, but increasingly what those mandates should encompass. The question of who truly controls the Bank of England admits no simple answer. Legally, the institution belongs to the British state, its capital held by the Treasury Solicitor on behalf of the government. Operationally, the Governor and Court of Directors determine strategy and policy within frameworks established by Parliament. Yet these formal arrangements capture only part of the reality. The networks of relationship connecting the bank to international counterparts, to the financial industry it regulates, to the academic economists who provide intellectual frameworks, all exercise influence that escapes organizational charts. The ideology of central bank independence functions to insulate these arrangements from democratic challenge. The argument that monetary policy requires protection from short-sighted politicians carries sufficient plausibility to forestall deeper inquiry. Technical expertise substitutes for democratic deliberation, presenting choices with profound distributional consequences as mere optimization problems best left to specialists. The governed accept their exclusion from monetary decisions with resignation born of incomprehension, trusting that those who understand such mysteries will exercise their power wisely. Yet the record of recent decades provides grounds for skepticism about this technocratic faith. The financial crisis revealed that experts confident in their models had constructed an intellectual edifice built on sand. The uneven recovery exposed the distributional consequences that supposedly neutral policies produced. The inflation surge demonstrated the limits of forecasting and the costs of delayed response. Each failure generated not reform, but further accumulation of powers meant to prevent recurrence, without ever questioning whether concentrated authority itself posed dangers. The ordinary citizen contemplating the Bank of England encounters an institution designed to inspire confidence through mystery. The neoclassical facade projecting stability and permanence. The careful communications calibrated to reassure without revealing. The dense technical language constructing barriers against unwelcome questions. The historical narratives celebrating institutional wisdom while omitting inconvenient episodes. All these elements combine to produce deference toward an authority whose actual operations remain obscure to those whose lives it shapes. The future of money itself hangs in the balance as the bank navigates these transitions, whether digital currencies enhance freedom or enable surveillance, whether climate finance promotes sustainability or corrupts central bank independence, whether expanded mandates serve public welfare or entrench technocratic power. These questions will be decided in the coming years. The decisions made on Threadneedle Street will echo through generations, yet most people will remain unaware that choices were even being made. The Bank of England has survived 3 centuries by adapting to circumstances its founders could never have anticipated. From financing wars against France to managing digital currencies, from backing the gold standard to creating money through keystrokes, the institution has demonstrated remarkable capacity for transformation while maintaining continuity of identity. Whether this adaptability serves the public interest or merely the interests of those who benefit from existing arrangements remains the central question that histories like this one can illuminate but never definitively resolve. Sleep approaches and the mind drifts toward rest. The ancient institution continues its operations through the night. Screens glow in trading rooms, monitoring global markets. Algorithms process data, seeking patterns that might inform tomorrow's decisions. Somewhere, a committee prepares for meetings that will shape the cost of borrowing for millions. The machinery of monetary power never fully sleeps, even as those subject to its authority surrender consciousness until morning. The Bank of England endures, as it has endured through wars and crises and transformations beyond counting, its true nature remaining as elusive as it was when merchants first gathered in grocers' hall to launch an experiment in public finance that would reshape the world. The story told across these hours captures only fragments of a history too vast for any single narrative to contain. Documents remain classified, memories have faded, and motivations lie buried with those who held them. What survives in archives and accounts offers glimpses rather than comprehensive views, suggestions rather than certainties. The hidden history of the Bank of England remains partially hidden still, its full dimensions awaiting investigators yet unborn who will bring questions we cannot anticipate to evidence we have not discovered. Until then, the institution guards its mysteries while performing its functions, ancient and modern at once, familiar yet ultimately unknowable, shaping lives while remaining beyond the grasp of those it serves. The night deepens and thoughts dissolve into the formless territory between waking and sleep. Numbers and policies and historical episodes lose their sharp edges, blending into impressions that need not cohere. The Bank of England, 300 years of accumulated power and compromise and adaptation, settles into memory as images rather than arguments. A building on a narrow street, vaults descending into London clay, notes promising to pay the bearer, its decisions rippling outward through countless lives, its money itself, that strange abstraction on which so much depends, resting tonight on foundations no more solid than collective belief. In the morning, the world will wake, and currencies will circulate, and interest will accrue, the system functioning because enough people trust that it will. For now, let consciousness fade into whatever dreams may come, carrying whispered knowledge of powers that operate whether we attend to them or not.